Welcome, everybody. I'm Bob Lee, the president of the China Society of Southern California. This program is co-sponsored by the China Society of Southern California, the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, and the Textile Museum Associates. This program is being recorded, and I'd like to let you know that all of our Zoom programs are recorded if our speaker permits, and they can be seen on YouTube. And this includes the previous programs by our today's speaker, David Hugus. I should also mention that we co-sponsored a program of the Chinese Historical Society, Chinese and the Yosemite Story. And that was just last week. Unfortunately, our bulletin came out too late, so it wasn't announced, but it is a very good program. And many of you who might be interested in Chinese American history and the history of national parks and the Chinese in California might want to see the program, which is also on the Chinese Historical Society's YouTube. I think we'll start the program portion now. Many of you have seen the past programs of David Hugus. David has been a longtime friend of the China Society. He came out as a co-author of a book over 20 years ago, which dealt with ladder to the clouds and Chinese rank badges. And since that time, he has studied more and more about rank badges and the ladder to the clouds and the system of scholars and the civil service system in Imperial China. So he was able to put this all in a recent book, Chinese Rank Badges, Symbol of Power, Wealth, and Intellect in the Ming and Qing Dynasties. And we're very fortunate, I think, to be able to do a rather extensive study on this because of David. Instead of having just one program, we are going to have essentially 5 programs. And I think it's going to be a very important reference that will be available on YouTube and also available on his book. David has been started as just a collector who had a tremendous intellect and curiosity, who was able to study rank badges and study them in a very complete way, which is far beyond, I think, the scope of most collectors. And I think we're privileged to have him give us his talk. This talk will be Chinese Rank Badges Part 2, which will deal with the period from around 1732 to 1820. Following this, we will have a third program on the evolutionary design of Chinese rank badges, which will cover the period from 1820 to the early Republic. And that hopefully will be on March 7th, our next meeting. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to David.
Thank you, Bob. And also thanks to Felicia and USC for hosting this presentation. It's my privilege and my pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about something that I feel deeply passionate about. my control of the badges went bluey for a short while. The introductory comments are essentially the same comments that I made the last time. And that's essentially what Bob has said, that I've been studying rank badges, and in particular, the way the design evolved over time for slightly over 30 years. One of the problems that I find is that I don't have any cohorts doing the same thing who can question what I conclude. So I'm offering my insights as the best idea that I have about how the design evolved. And I'm not certain that I am absolutely accurate, but I think that I'm doing better than just classifying badges by the century in which they were made. We're going to talk about Qing Dynasty badges tonight, but before we get into that, there were a couple of questions from a previous presentation, and I'd like to address them quickly, just so that there are no lingering issues from the last discussion. Mr. Chuck Blue asked about the design of the back badges and whether or not they were mirror images or exact duplicates of the front badges. I asserted at that time without proof that the badges were identical. Let me now demonstrate that that's the case. Here's a pair of badges from the Congee Emperor's period. Notice that both of the badges are split. These badges are brocade, and because both of them are split, they were obviously made as an integral part of the costume, the jacket on which they were worn. The loom width was only half the width of a jacket, and so when the badges were made as part of the jacket itself, both the front and the back badges were split. I got a very good deal on these badges when I bought them, I think because a lot of people were concerned that both badges were split, and they thought that meant that they were fake, but that's not the case. It's just an issue of the width of the looms at the time. Here's Congee Emperor's badges. We've seen this before, embroidered badges. So the front badge is split and the back badge is not. But this is from Congee Emperor. Notice that the qilin does not face the sun. That'll be important when we talk about one of the conventional wisdom things that's not quite so smart. Here's a Yangjin pair, also embroidered. We'll see these badges later on. Again, the front badge is split, the back one is not. Qianlong Emperor, the same situation, and Ja Ching. And finally, we won't get to these badges tonight, but the Daoguang period badges. And so the point is that throughout the Qing Dynasty, front badges and back badges were identical to each other. And so that meant that the front badge faced one direction, the back badge faced the other. And just a matter of interest, that when the badges were not made as part of the garment on which they were worn, the badges were made separately on pieces of black silk, and the front badge, the two halves were separated by about 4 or 5 inches, so that there was material that could be used to overlap inside the jacket when the badge was attached to a jacket. One other question that was asked was, why should we learn about Congee rank badges? And the answer is, so you don't buy the badge that's shown here. This is a badge that I bought about 2 or 3 years ago, specifically so that I could show an example of an excellent fake rank badge without getting into legal or bureaucratic administrative difficulties by calling somebody else's rank badge fake. But I haven't seen any fake Congee rank badges on the auction sites that I get updates on in the last year or so. But prior to that, you could find a fake Congee rank badge almost every month on at least one of the sites that I follow. And so one of the things that one needs to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about fakes in the next presentation, is that it's very seldom that there's a single characteristic associated with a badge that raises an alarm, but usually a series of things that appear out of the ordinary. And we all need to keep in mind that there was a great variety among rank badges, and a single design element different from other badges of the same period does not necessarily mean that it's fake, but it's when several things appear to be not quite right that you get disinclined to consider it a real badge. But learning and knowing about badges from all periods during the Ming and Qing Dynasty is valuable in helping you to avoid errors. So we'll go on to the topic for tonight. And just as a review, remember that when Ming badges are compared to Qing badges, the Qing badges had borders where the Ming badges did not. Qing badges were smaller, and the front badges were necessarily split because they were worn on a short riding jacket, while Ming badges were worn on traditional Chinese robes that fastened down the right side, and so neither the front nor the rear Ming badges needed to be split. Wives were specifically authorized to wear a badge under the Ming Dynasty court regulations, where the Ming Dynasty was silent on that subject. But wives were directed to wear a badge identical to her husband's, but they were largely ignored because that would mean that when a wife sat with her husband, her bird would have looked away from him, and that implied discourtesy, rankled the cultural sensitivities. So wives largely wore mirror image badges so that their bird would look at their husband's bird in mutual admiration and respect. The Qing rank badges followed the Ming customs until the Qing court regulations were actually published in 1652, 8 years after the dynasty was founded. Unlike most Ming animals, Qing animals are primarily shown standing upright. The badge size of the Qing badges varied considerably over the Qing dynasty. Started out relatively large because Ming badges were large, but hit their smallest size during the Yangjin emperor's reign. And contrary to conventionalism, the sun disk was rapidly adopted during the Qing dynasty. We see Shunzi badges. As a matter of fact, the peacock badges I showed you from the Shunzi period have sun badges, and they were female badges. And so the peacock badges that we saw as pairs indicated not only that the sun disk was rapidly adopted, but wife wore rank badges early in Qing dynasty and primarily mirror image badges. And we'll notice that the Qilin did not look at the sun disk. And the reason for that is that I believe that the sun disk stood for a Chinese proverb that literally was transferred, aim at the sun and rise high. If you want to be a little looser in the translation, if you set your goals as high as the sun, you will achieve success. And the only way that wearer of a Qilin, who was number one military rank could raise high was if he became the emperor. And even the slightest intimation that you were considering replacing the emperor could get you a very unpleasant death. And so the Qilins and nobles badges either had no sun or had a creature that did not look at the sun. And unlike conventional wisdom, we'll encounter a couple of counted stitch-on gauze badges in the Qinlong Emperor's reign. And that indicates that counted stitch was not introduced in the mid-1800s, as a lot of writers seem to think. Before we get started on today's topic, let's remind ourselves where we left off last time. If you remember, late during the Congee period, one of the prime characteristics is the gold background transformed from mirroring the outline of the elements of the design in that to having just a straight horizontal presentation of the gold background. One of the other major things that happened is that this cloud form, which had been the kind of quintessential Congee cloud form for most of that period, got transformed into this cloud form that had previously had only a subsidiary role to play. In one, I've seen a single example where the angle on this cloud form was even a little sharper than this, a little obtuse, a little more than a right angle, which will lead us into the cloud design that we will see during the Yungzheng Emperor's reign. The Yungzheng Emperor, I think, doesn't get nearly the credit he deserves, being sandwiched in between the two longest reigning emperors in recorded Chinese history. He only served for 13 years, but he was one of the most dynamic emperors that China had ever had. He had the land resurveyed, revised the taxes, made it easier for people to raise themselves up from mean status into commoner status, which would allow them to compete for rank badges, and did an awful lot of things that were unusual in the emperor. He had very firm control over the bureaucracy and just was an excellent emperor. As a matter of fact, he worked himself to death. His day typically started at 5 a.m. and ended at midnight. About a year and a half before he died, he took sick and had to stay in bed. But contrary to the advice of his advisors, he worked from bed, got up before he was supposed to, and essentially worked himself to death. So one of the things that I have come to believe is that in some manner, the character of the emperor is expressed in the rank badges. And so in the Yungzheng period, we have a very dynamic artistic culture that had a tremendous number of different designs over the short period that the Yungzheng Emperor was on the throne. What we see here is this cloud form is, you can imagine that L-shaped cloud form from the last Congee badge we saw, with the end straightened out and extended. Then you have this cloud form that is characteristic of the Yungzheng period. We also see that the border is a very thin gold line, and the border is primarily composed of the clouds themselves. And so the clouds are actually creating the border. We have the same limited wealth symbols on either side of the rock. This is the start of the Yangjin design element that will carry this extenuated cloud form for a long period of time. One of the things that this badge reminds me of is that a little while ago I saw a fake Yangjin badge. There was a golden pheasant. There were several things that were wrong with the badge. The bird was too small. It was only about this size. The colors were extremely bright for a Yangjin badge. We'll see a single bright Yangjin badge, but most Yangjin badges had kind of a muted color palette. There were no clouds in the interior of the badge. And the final thing that caught my attention is the clouds were Daoguang clouds that had this elongated shape and circular shape on both sides of the edge, while these clouds kind of have a flat edge here. And that was kind of the final thing that led me to conclude that that badge was a fake badge. But the point is, details are important, and you need to consider all of the elements of a rank badge when addressing its authenticity. This is kind of an unusual badge. It harkens back to Congee with a gold background, but that was probably just an individual desire on the part of the silver pheasant wearer. We have the same general kind of clouds, even more extended than before, and multicolored as before. We have some very small wealth symbols in the water, the same kind of Congee water forms where the slope of the water form is steeper toward the rock than it is going away from the rock. But one of the things that is very unusual about this badge, it's not clear looking at it this way, can be seen here, that these are places where the gold foil has deteriorated and the basic cotton thread that the gold foil was wrapped around is showing through. But the two things that I'm interested in is that we have a very unusual couching technique here. There are two things about this that are unusual. One is that this is silk couching silk as opposed to silk couching metallic thread. The other thing is that the couching is in this tight spiral pattern as opposed to just the usual occasional loops. This particular couching technique I have only seen in Yangjin badges, and only 2 badges at that. It's very, very unusual embroidery technique for this badge. This is kind of a one-off badge that doesn't fit neatly in the sequence that we're talking about. But this is a Yangjin badge for several reasons. Number one, it has no border, and the border was not lost. It really did have no border. But it harkens back to a design that we saw in the Shunzi period, where we had these in the Yungzheng, in the Shunzi period, multicolored lines here, white lines running horizontally through the cloud design. But unlike Shunzi period, we have wealth symbols in the water, and we have the first representation of the deep water that mirrors the design of the hem of the dragon robes. And all of those things are different from the design that you would have seen in the Shunzi badge. And so this is a Yangjin badge, although it's a very unusual one. This is a very interesting badge. This is one of the pair that I showed you before. It's starting to modify the cloud forms. This is a cloud form kind of similar to the one that we saw on the first Yangjin badge that we saw, but we're now starting to see more flowing cloud forms and cloud forms that don't have the sharp point at all of their ends. We also have the introduction of one of the design elements that is characteristic of Yangjin, but will appear periodically in Qinlong as well. And this is this kind of either a circular cloud, circular water form, or spiral, depending on whether you look at the outside edge, which would incline you to call it a circle, or look at the internal design, which would incline you to call it a spiral. But this is a design element that will pop up in not only the Yangjin, but occasionally also in Qinlong. One of the things that is unusual about this badge that also is not clearly recognizable, this is the first all-metallic badge that we have seen. It appears that it's embroidered with colors, but that's an illusion. What we have is the same kind of couching technique that we saw on the silver pheasant before, only now instead of the couching, silk couching silk, we have silk couching the metallic threads. And so all of the base threads in this badge are gold metallic threads. The color is provided by this very dense spiral couching technique. Very unusual. These are the only two badges I've ever seen that display that couching technique. This is another kind of an unusual badge in that it's brocade. It's silver pheasant. It has the circular water forms that we've seen before. It also goes back to having the clouds form the border of the badge. This is unusual in that the wealth symbols are not the rolls of silk and rhinoceros horn and things we've seen, but they're bronze vessels. And bronze vessels were so valuable at this particular point that they were often used as collateral in business deals. And so bronze vessels are legitimate wealth symbols, but this is the only badge I've seen that had bronze vessels as wealth symbols. We have multicolored clouds, the 5 colored clouds are auspicious, all attached to the clouds in the border. And so they seem to be kind of flowing out of the clouds from the border. And this will be a characteristic that we'll see in the next couple of badges. It's a female paradise flycatcher with the same characteristics that we had before, the circular water form, clouds forming the border of the badge. We also had, the clouds being attached to the border clouds as they wind their way into the interior. One of the things that is interesting and new about this badge is the rebus that we find here. There are 2 of them. The vase is a rebus for peace, and we have here the halberd, which is an anti-cavalry long infantry weapon, and the jade chime. And only in the Yangjin badges do you see those 2 elements attached to each other with either a ribbon or a string. The two items together stand for good luck and good fortune. The string or the ribbon has a connotation of continuous, and so by attaching them with a ribbon or a string, it's a may you have continuous good luck and good fortune. Here we have our one really colorful Yangjin badge. The interesting things about this, number one, is the color palette. Also the fact that it is introducing bats into the design. The clouds in the interior are still attached to the border, but the border now is a pair of thin gold lines as opposed to the clouds as before. We have the circular water design here. Here's another example of the halberd and jade chime rebus connected with the ribbon. If you read this as a ruyi scepter, as opposed to just a mushroom shape, you can read that rebus as may your wishes for continuous good luck and good fortune be granted. This Now we're taking the kind of flowing internal clouds that we've seen in the last couple of badges and detaching them from the border. But you still have this kind of a flowing, continuous type of badge, of cloud forms in this particular badge. This is an interesting badge. It demonstrates one of the characteristics of the dyes at the period. The deterioration here is caused by the dye itself. At this point in time, the black dye was made from walnut shells, which were very acidic. And so the dye itself carried with it the seeds of destruction of the threads that it was used to dye. And so if you see a badge of this general time period that has a lot of black in it that is not deteriorated, you might want to consider that a questionable characteristic. But we have relatively large well symbols here in either side of the border and the circular water design as we have seen in the past. This starts a completely different orientation on the background and the clouds of the Yangjin badges that will carry through us through the end of this emperor's reign. Notice that this is a qilin, and so it is not looking at the sun. This is a female badge. The only difference between a female and a male qilin badge is the placement of the sun. The qilin has the same posture and looks out toward the people viewing the badge. It does not look at the sun. But what we see here is this kind of continuous rolling cloud form repeated, covering the entire background of the badge. And we seem to have two kinds of clouds here. We have the basic blue clouds that form about half of the cloud formations in here. And then we have the multicolor clouds that kind of fill in the other areas. We also have a relatively large land mass that's normally associated with Qinlin badges, but we see that sometimes in Yangjin badges as well. This is another example of a goose badge that has the same general characteristic. You see the blue cloud forms rolling down here in between and intermixed with the multicolor clouds. This may be hard to see because of the darkness of the color palette, but now the difference in the cloud forms come in two different ways. Instead of having both types of clouds have this kind of a rolling continuous kind of a shape, we have some of the clouds in a very small repetitious pattern that tend to form the background of the badges, and their darker blue badges seem to be overlaid on top of the lighter blue badges. And so we have kind of a double layer of clouds in this badge for the first time. And that is an evolutionary step in the way that the clouds are presented. We see the introduction of the 9 peaches in the badges and some delicate small wealth symbols in the water and our circular water form. This double layer of clouds is either more pronounced here. I mean, we see the blue repetitious background clouds clearly are overlaid by the kind of a long sinuous rolling cloud forms that are done in green. Circular water form as well. This is the badge we saw before. It repeats the pattern of the last 2 badges with the repetitious background badges and the long sinuous blue badges overlaying that. It may be hard to see because of the color palette, but we have the jade chime and the halberd here attached by a string for good luck and good fortune one more time. The most important thing about this badge, however, is that this is the first use of the pagoda as iconography on a rank badge. The pagoda has a connotation of immortality. It's supposed to represent the palace of the immortals on the island of the immortals. This will be carried forward into Qianlong in the early part of that emperor's reign as one of the iconographies in the rank badges. Oftentimes, when you get to the border of an emperor's reign, you get a badge that has mixed messages, and you're not really sure whether it's late example of the previous badge or an early example of the succeeding badge. But the characteristics that link this to the Yangjin period are the double layer of clouds, a repetitious background layer, the sinuous clouds on the top. But what links this to the Qianlong period is you have a more realistic representation of the water in the pool here and the stream over here, and you have an introduction of the pine tree. Both the naturalistic representation of the water and the introduction of the pine tree are things that are normally considered as Qianlong iconography. And so it's kind of a coin toss as to whether or not you consider this a late Yangjin badge or a very early Qianlong badge. But what we're really talking about then is whether or not this badge was produced in 1734 or 35, or whether it was done in 36 or 37. And when we end up talking about when the badge was made in terms of 1 or 2 years, we can see that we've made considerable progress from the time when we only considered rank badges as belonging to a particular century. So now we'll transition into the Qianlong Emperor. And we have, again, a badge that has some of the Yangjin characteristics and some of the characteristics that are more normally associated with Qianlong. We have the double layer of clouds, but in this particular case, the topmost layer, instead of being the long sinuous cloud forms that we've seen in Yangjin, we're having little clusters of clouds here. And that's one of the things that inclines me to put this in the Qianlong bucket as opposed to the Yangjin bucket. We have good luck, good fortune, but again, the good luck, the jade chime is superimposed over the halberd, not attached to it with a string or a ribbon, which also indicates that it's Qianlong, not Yangjin. We have the deep water representation that we've seen in some of the Yangjin badges, as well as Qianlong. This is another example that carries a lot of the Yangjin heritage in it, with a double layer of clouds, with a repetitious background layer. But again, we have the upper layer of the clouds are clustered, not these long sinuous cloud forms, and the clouds themselves are kind of circular with wavy edges on the clouds, which make them significantly different from the clouds that we've seen in Yangjin. Again, we have the halberd and jade chime with the jade chime superimposed over the halberd, circular water forms, which will pop up periodically during the Qianlong period. We have a demon protection rebus over here on the other side, along with the pearls as wealth symbols. The Qianlong design then moved away from filling out the background with this repetitious cloud design, but they still felt they had to fill in every square inch of the background, so they included the gold scroll work in the background in this particular badge. We have increased vegetation that is generally associated with the Qianlong period. Again, we have two major masses of clouds as opposed to clouds weaving their way across the surface of the badge. We have the two different forms of the water, the more classic ways of representing water, and the deep water represented in both the left and the right side of the badge. One final badge where we had to fill up the entire background of the badge. We have the bats being introduced for the first time in Qianlong, not the first time in this period, because we saw bats once in the Yangjin period. But again, the clustered mass of clouds in a single location, the nine peaches, the pine tree, and increased vegetation, the combination of the deep water and the regular representation of the water in this badge. Now from this badge, we'll go to a relatively stark change where now the background is totally clean and just shows the basic black silk of the background. Clouds are still clumped in small areas in the badge. We have the pagoda as a symbol of immortality, along with the crane badge. We see the waterfall used to represent the water, as well as this pond where the water is accumulating. And again, this is a more naturalistic representation of the water that's generally associated with Qianlong, and then the deep water representation over here. So another crane badge. The gold background was probably an individual choice on the person who commissioned this particular badge, but the characteristics of the previous badge we see here again, the clumps of clouds, the pine tree, and the dual representation of the water form. Here, this particular badge is notable more for the bird than the design. The design itself is a continuation of what we've seen before, with the clumps of the clouds, with the clouds themselves having relatively circular shapes. The interesting thing that for me in this badge is that this is a cheating goose. It has the smooth head, the wedge-shaped tail of a goose, but instead of having the yellowish, brownish body coloration and the comma marks indicating the body feathers, this bird is completely white and has no body markings at all. It's hoping that you will mistake him for a crane. So he is a goose, but he is cheating. Here's a goose who's playing by the rules. He not only has the feather markings, but detailed representation of the feathers. The clouds are a bit unusual in that in that you have the clouds separated by color in their representation and presentation here. Again, most of the cloud forms are having a generally circular form, but they're starting to take on the mushroom shape that will be more characteristic in later periods. You have the steep mountains that are associated with the Qianlong period and the dual representation of the water. So another goose is playing by the rules. Again, the same general characteristics, the clouds with the circular form, but now they have this white dot in the center that is an evolution of the way that the clouds are presented. The same steep mountains on either side, vegetation, the fungus, and the wealth symbols. If our previous cheating goose was a bad cheater. This goose is cheating even worse. You may note the kind of ragged edges of the wings and some of the cloud design here. That's because this is a counted stitch-on gauze badge. And what you're seeing is kind of the square shape of the gauze openings that are filled with the counted stitch. This is the first use of counted stitch on gauze in the evolution of the rank badge design. The clouds are still clumped and multicolored, still generally circular, still have the white dot in the center. The goose has all the bad characteristics of the previous one. You know, it has a smooth head and the wedge-shaped tail that clearly mark it as a goose, but he not only is missing all of the markings on the body that he's supposed to have and has changed his color from yellow to white, but he also has this little red dot right at the end of his bill, really hoping that you're going to mistake him for a crane. This is a silver pheasant badge, very, very nicely done, very austere, very clear and crisp. Same general kind of cloud formations, although we're starting to see the clouds now starting to flow more across the background of the border. The highly colorful mountain, the pine tree, circular badge, circular water forms, all complete the design elements of this particular badge. It's another cheating badge. This is a Paradise Flycatcher that wants you to think that he's the silver pheasant we just looked at, because he has 3 tail feathers, but they have the distinguishing Paradise Flycatcher dot, which makes him unambiguously a 9th level official who was trying to present himself as a 5th level official. One of the things I find very interesting about this badge is its very stark, almost uniform color palette. I may or may not have mentioned this before, but in Imperial China, blue and green were considered shades of the same color. The color is called Qing, and it covered anything from a light gray all the way to very dark blue. And so the Chinese would see this as almost a monochromatic badge with these different colors just being different shades of the same color. We have this very unusual, very solid representation of the deep water that's very much like the badges we're going to see in the 1850s and after that. We're starting now to see the Qinglong clouds take on the kind of flowing nature that we'd seen in the Yangjin badges. You know, the cloud forms now are starting to flow across the background of the badge, and they're not just little solid clumps of badges, of clouds. We see the 9 peaches on the peach tree. One of the things that distinguishes Qinglong peach trees from Daoguang peach trees is Qinglong peach trees generally kind of twisty, and Daoguang peach trees generally have a much simpler shape. So one of the ways to distinguish between peaches in a Qinglong badge and peaches on a Daoguang badge is how twisty the tree is. We have the deep water and the regular representation of the water, the peonies being introduced first time, and 2 bats. Interesting that in this male badge, we have a female number of red bats involved. This is our second counted stitch on gauze example. It's a mandarin duck, has neck feathers that one would associate with mandarin duck, wedge-shaped tail. and colorful body. Again, the clouds are starting to flow across the background. We have the twisty tree with the 9 peaches. We have 3 bats in this particular badge. At least we've got a male number of bats involved in this. We have the halberd and jade chime as a good luck, good fortune rebus, and demon protection for other rebus on the other side of the rock. This is my most favorite Siachai in the entire world. He really looks commanding and dominating, just the kind of badge you'd want to have on somebody who was tasked with discovering corrupt and inefficient officials in bureaucracy. A really nice representation of this fierce dragon head with a single horn to gore people who lie to him. He just is kind of a magnificent representation of the Siachai. The clouds, again, are starting to flow across the background, and as we will see, continue in Qinlong and then in Ja Ching. But this is just my favorite Siachai badge ever. This goose badge is interesting for one particular item that I'll show you in just a second. Again, the clouds are starting to be sinuous and flowing across the badges. We have the trees on either side of the badge, the naturalistic representation of water. But the thing that's really unique about this badge is the way that the goose's foot is represented. I have only seen, I think, 3 badges in the 30 years that I've been looking at them that showed a bird that had a webbed foot when the bird actually had a webbed foot in real life. So this is a very unique, interesting badge, one of the very few badges that show at least one naturalistic foot. Notice that the upraised foot is not webbed. The clouds in this badge are really starting to flow across the design. The peach tree is a little less twisty than it was before, starting to almost look like a Daoguang peach tree. But the cloud forms here are also taking on a very distinctive mushroom shape that will carry through for about the next 80 or 100 years. We have the wealth symbols in either side. We have the peonies that were introduced a few badges ago. It's an interesting peacock badge. The unusual representation of the peacock's head, where it has a couple of feathers as opposed to having a crested head, but it has the eye of the peacock, just as the tail feathers do. So the identification of this bird is still unambiguous. The clouds flowing across the thing with the mushroom shape, and as before, the pine tree that we've come to associate with the Qinlong badges, large landmass, and circular water design. This is a very nice Siachai, not nearly as nice as my favorite, but demonstrates the same characteristics of the badges we've seen before. The peach tree with a kind of a twisty peach tree with the 9 peaches, the mushroom-shaped clouds in the badges, and the pine tree that we've come to that recognizes kind of a common feature of the Qinlong badges, the double representation of the water at the bottom. We're getting very close to the end of Qinlong period. We see the clouds are starting to take on an almost totally linear fashion, almost going back to forming a border like they did in the early Yangjin badges. but we have 5 bats. Not that we hadn't seen 5 bats before, but these bats are unusual in that each bat is carrying an object in its mouth for a rebus meaning. And this is the first time that we have seen the bats carrying things in their mouths. And this is a characteristic of this badge late in the Qianlong period. The pine tree and peonies that are becoming kind of a standard part of the design. This is our last Qianlong badge. Notice how the clouds form a border all the way across the top of the badge. This will be something that we'll see in the Ja Ching badges. This is the first, last, and only military badge that we've seen in the Qianlong period. He is a lion for sure. He has curls on his head, curls on his backbone, and curls on his tail. So he's a legitimate lion. He's not a bear who's trying to appear like a lion. We now go to our final emperor for the night, the Ja Ching Emperor. Ja Ching Emperor badges are really kind of easy to sequence and keep track of. All you need to do, with the obvious always exception at the very beginning and very end, is look at the border and count the badges. So we'll start with an exception. This is a very unusual badge. I've only seen 2 of these badges in the entire time I've been collecting. There's a very distinctive border, a bat with a dragon, a show, a dragon, and a bat. And the thing that's unusual about this is that it has this deep water representation that people normally associated with badges from the 1850s and later. And this only existed for a very short period of time. Like I say, I've only seen 2 badges of this nature. Had 5 bats, all red, and so they're relatively easy to identify, although I can go crazy trying to count Yangjin badges. This badge down here at the bottom is associated with water to form a rebus. May your happiness be as vast as the Eastern Sea. But this is a very unique border that we will see in the next version of the Ja Ching badges as well. So here we have the bat, dragon, show, dragon, bat border. We have 9 bats here. I go crazy trying to count Ja Ching bats for a couple reasons. Number one, not all the bats are red. Some of the bats are blue, and they're positioned in weird places. There are 9 bats here. Just to make it easy for myself and you, here are the 9 bats circled so that you can count them, and there are in fact 9, and there they are. And like I say, most of these bats are blue, and they blend in to the background of the badge, and it makes it difficult for me anyway to identify the badge, where the bats are on occasion. Notice that the cloud forms have taken on almost a vine-like characteristic. They're very stylized. They have the white dot associated with the very late Qianlong badges that we saw. But the cloud forms are unique to Ja Ching, as is the color palette. All of the Ja Ching badges have this kind of a dark-hued color palette that kind of gives it kind of a dark, kind of a sinister view. Notice that there's very little in the water, just a single wealth item here and the Ruyi scepter on the other side, but the water itself is bare of symbols. This just shows that the military followed the same general pattern. I won't try and count them for you because I'd probably get it wrong, but there are 9 bats in this badge. with the bat dragon show border that we saw on the previous civil badge. Same cloud formation, very vine-like cloud formation, and very little in the way of iconography in the water. The next way that the design changed is the border changed. And so the dragon was foreshortened and replaced with a lotus. And we have a different long life symbol on these badges. There are 7 badges, 7 bats on badges that have this particular border design. And again, I won't try and count them because I'd probably get it wrong, but there are 7 badges here. Military did the same way. This is unusual in that it does not have the typical Ja Ching border, but this is a military badge from the same general period. There are 7 bats here and very little in the way of iconography in the water. Interesting thing, 3 things happened that are very interesting in the next phase of the evolution. The border turned to all lotus. There are 5 bats always now in the badge. And very interesting that we now see the Taoist symbols in the water. I would never, not really sure as to why it took so long for the Taoist symbols to show up. I originally had thought that it might have been a deference to his father, the Qinglong Emperor, who was still alive when Ja Ching Emperor took the throne. But Qinglong Emperor died in 1799. And here we are getting very close to the end of the Ja Ching Emperor's reign. And so we're about 1810, 1815 at this particular point. I'm inclined to believe that the Ja Ching Emperor was a late convert to Taoism, and that's why the Taoist symbols showed up very late in his rank badges. This is shown only to indicate that sometimes people went gaudy and did an all gold badge, even in Ja Ching. The design elements are exactly the same, the lotus border, 5 bats, same kind of cloud pattern, and the same Taoist symbols in the waterline. The final design change did not change either the border or the bats, but changed only the internal part of the design. That I think I failed to mention this up to this point, but all Ja Ching badges are done all in seed stitch. Very laborious, very detailed stitch, very difficult to do in large areas like a rank badge. But in this particular case, they decided to make a hard job and make it even more difficult. And they colored in the entire background with light blue seed stitch embroidery. Very, very difficult technique. All of the other characteristics are the same, same border, same bat, same clouds, same Taoist symbols. The only difference is the light blue on the interior of the badge. Military did the same thing. And this is our final badge of the night. It is to indicate that in preparation for going to the Daoguang, the Ja Ching badges did have a Greek fret border. The reason that this string is shown here is this badge was converted into a clutch purse. So this was the backbone of the perch that was folded over. It has a jade charm that was associated with it. But I wanted to show you that we did have a Greek fret in the Ja Ching badge design very late in the period, ready to trend into Daoguang. And that concludes the presentation with a final pitch for the book. It's now available on Amazon. It's also available from Bob at his company, and you can get it from the publisher if you want to pay the shipping charges from Hong Kong. So that's it. Bob, it's back to you.
Muted.
I can hear you, sir.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay. Can you see me?
Yes, sir, I can.
Oh, great, because I can't see myself. I thought that was it was an eye opener for me. And I think I will have to look at badges again and try to get all of the elements that you were talking about into my badges. Of course, my badges are primarily late 19th century. So, but maybe there's something in there that would be earlier. I was wondering, Felicia, are there any other questions?
Not yet. So if anyone has a question, you can just send it to me directly in the chat.
I think, it's fairly difficult to get these earlier badges. I think maybe, I don't know, when I look at the things that I have, and they've been accumulated over the years, they all seem to be late 19th century. And maybe I'm going to have to look again to see, oh, maybe I have something a little bit earlier. But is there, I'm just wondering, for the earlier badges, you don't have earlier badges that are not the best quality. Is that because people only preserve the better ones, or did they have different qualities in earlier badges also?
Yeah, the preservation of badges is always kind of an interesting thing. Let me get that, but let me address your main point before. I recognize the accuracy of your comment about the availability of badges increases as their age decreases. And just like it's easier to find people aged 25 than it is to find people aged 105. And the older the badges get, the rarer they become. But one of the things that I would encourage people to adopt as an attitude is you need to understand the design elements of the earlier badges, because people are making excellent fakes of badges from those periods. And if you're not familiar with the design elements of the earlier badges, you can make an expensive and embarrassing mistake. And so kind of as a self-defense technique, I think understanding the design elements of the earlier badges is an unimportant thing for anybody who is interested in buying badges at all. Now, to get back to the preservation issue, one of the characteristics of the Chinese society was that the Chinese in the imperial period believed that every person had two souls. One was a heavenly soul that went to join ancestors' souls in heaven and could be used as an intermediary to help make heaven look favorably upon China as a whole and a particular family in particular. But there was this earthly soul that was associated with the places and things that were important to a person while they were alive. And the earthly soul was not necessarily benign. And so people tended not to associate with things that had belonged to an ancestor because of the fear that they might irritate this earthly soul, and the earthly soul would then wreak havoc on their lives in the real world. And so the preservation of things associated with dead people varied quite significantly. And I suspect that most of the badges that we see from the earlier periods were just put away in a box and put away someplace in some storage area, only to be discovered either by descendants very late after the people had passed away, or to be captured and taken by looters. In both the two opium wars, the Boxer Rebellion and the Taiping Rebellion, all gave looters a great opportunity to acquire things that had been stored away for a long period of time. So the preservation of the older articles to include rank badges was probably very uneven, depended very much on how a particular family felt about preserving items that were associated with people who had died.
Well, I guess that makes sense.
We have one question.
Oh, great.
This is from Chuck Wu. Can you tell me your modus operandi in looking at an unknown badge? How important is it to correctly identify the type of weave and type of stitch, i.e. peking, satin, etc.?
The things that I tend to look for are the ancillary background items. Those are the things that I think are more likely to represent the particular period involved. A person might specifically want to have certain rebuses included in his design, may have wanted the bird or his animal to look in a particular way. But I suspect that when they got down to what was in the background, it was, put clouds here, put some vegetation here, let's have a mountain and some water and all that kind of stuff. And those are the things that are most likely to represent the particular period involved. The only time where the embroidery technique becomes important is in Ja Ching, and that's because all Ja Ching badges were done in seed stitch. And so if you see something that purports to be a Ja Ching badge and is not seed stitch, chances are very good it's not genuine. But I look to clouds, I look to water forms, I look to iconography, those kinds of things that are less likely to have been specified by the person designing and ordering the badge. And so it's the background items that I find most important. And again, because of the variety of the badges, the long period of time over which badges were made, different artisans in different parts of the country, a single design element different from things you're used to seeing is not necessarily a disqualifying characteristic. You need to see if there are two or three things that look a little bit unusual and out of place. I mentioned before about the fake golden pheasant that I'd seen, and the four things that keyed me to question its authenticity were the size of the bird, the fact that there were no clouds in the interior of the badge, the bright color palette of the bird, and the fact that the edge clouds did not have kind of a flat edge on the outer side. And those are all kind of minor details that are very telling when it comes to determining whether or not a badge is authentic or not.
Well, does anybody have a record of a order sheet or a menu of what you would choose, what was available when you ordered the rank badge?
I think the general answer to that question, Bob, is no. And we'll get into this next time, but toward the end of the Daoguang period, the badge design kind of froze. And at that particular point, there was a set pattern that was used for the rank badges henceforth and evermore until things started to deteriorate. But up until that point, there was no pattern or design that was mandated. But like any kind of ritual clothing that denotes status, any kind of a high status garment has certain things that are current and certain things that are passé and certain things that are too avant-garde to be considered. And so, just like, in women's clothes, hemlines go up and down, color palettes change, one color is in one year, different colors in the next year. You have shoulders covered, shoulders bare kind of things. There are certain design elements that are current at that particular time. And I think that those unwritten rules of what constituted stylish chic at that particular point drove the design and drove the designs to be reasonably comparable in any one span of time. But my basic thesis is tastes change over time. What is current changes over time. Styles change over time. And that's why the badges evolved over time, because they were high status garments that reflected a person's status and position in society. And if you didn't have the right design, you were kind of out of touch and not really with it. And so that's why I think the designs generally tended to change in the same general pattern over time, just what was current and what was stylish at any particular moment.
Tell me, when did the seed stitch begin in rank badges? I mean, does it go back to Ming or the early Qing, or is it mainly a middle Qing phenomena?
That's a very interesting question, Bobby. It's something that I had never considered. I want to say that the first use of seed stitch was Ja Ching. And the reason I hesitate and I'm kind of looking blank is because I'm trying to reflect on whether or not I can recall any earlier badge that had seed stitch, and I'm coming up blank. And so I think I want to say that the Ja Ching Emperor introduced seed stitch into the badge design. Mm-hmm. And he did so with a vengeance. Every badge is completely done in seed stitch.
But I mean, it wasn't an imperial edict. Was it just a question of style that he liked the seed stitch, or so? I mean, was the seed stitch also used for the 9th rank, because it can be a very
the very first badge. The very first Ja Ching badge we saw was the 9th rank.
Oh, okay.
It was a female paradise flycatcher, and so it to the best of my knowledge, it made no difference what your rank was, whether it was military or civil. If it was a Ja Ching badge, it was done completely in seed stitch. And I want to say that was the first use of seed stitch, but that's not a question that I'd considered before, and I may need to recant that position, but I can't think of a badge prior to Ja Ching that had seed stitch in it.
Okay. I mean, it just seems that the seed stitch is very labor intensive, and that I would think that there were officials who were on a budget and did something else.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the seed. Well, I mean that's why the
Well, I mean, some seed stitches are really fine. I mean, you can say, oh, well, that's a forbidden stitch, but
Yeah.
other seed stitches are quite large and
yeah.
you know,
Well, I mean, the quality varied. I mean, by region, by artist, by shop, I'm sure. And I mean, seed stitches is a very laborious stitch, and that's why the misnomer of forbidden stitch, had some rationality, reasonableness behind it. It's a difficult stitch, but when it was introduced with a vengeance. And the mechanism, the mechanism that I'm hesitating because I'm about to say something that's opinion and stated as fact, but I believe that the emperor influenced the design of the badges in his reign. The mechanism that was used to do that is not clear. One can imagine the emperor, having a favorite artist or subsidizing certain artists that did things that he liked. And once the emperor expressed an opinion in one thing, I'm sure that the court would be very quick to adopt whatever the emperor's likes or dislikes happen to be. But the exact mechanism that was used to indicate what the emperor liked and didn't like is not obvious. I mean, one can guess and hypothesize, but the mechanism is not abundantly clear.
All right, we have some more questions. Let's see. Anne says, was a forbidden stitch also known as seed stitch?
The answer is yes. It was also known as Peking knot. I have a tendency to avoid that terminology because it's kind of smacks of colonial period pronunciation of the Chinese capital. But that particular stitch was known in China as Peking knot and seed stitch. The term forbidden stitch was a Western fabrication. It was probably used by dealers to try and make their wares more appealing and more exotic to people who were buying them. But that stitch was never forbidden in China.
Okay, Colin asks, would rank badge owners have new badges made periodically as style changed?
And my guess is the answer is yes, but that's never been recorded. But I think the best answer to that question is: would somebody wear a 3 years old dress to the Met Gala? And if the answer to the Met Gala question is no, then the answer is would you wear an out of style rank badge is also probably no.
All right, Linda Lum asks, how can you know a badge is a military badge?
It has an animal instead of a bird. Well,
I think you'll have to go to David's previous lecture, which is online.
Well, and as always, that was too crisp and too short an answer. Absent the Jiaqing, which is an animal worn by a civil official, the inspectors general for the emperor. If it's a military badge, it has an animal. If it is a civil badge, it has a bird. The Jiaqing is a crossover.
Okay, also from Linda Lum, These badges are very old. In your collection, how are these badges preserved? And are they kept in sealed airtight packages?
The answer to the last question is no. The more complete answer is they're kept in well until I delivered them to Christie's, they were kept in a Chinese linen cabinet of 18 drawers, so that there was no badge had more than, say, a dozen or so other badges on top of it. They were put in acid-free, archival quality photo protectors, so the badges were visible without having to touch them, and they were kept in a drawer out of the light. The light is the worst thing that you can do to a textile. Even artificial light color bleeds the rank badge and mutes the color palette. So you keep them out of the light, both natural and artificial. Protect them either by wearing gloves when you handle them, or put them in some kind of acid-free, transparent protective device. But they were not airtight, and they were not humidity controlled.
Okay, we have a question from Chuck Wu. I think you mentioned seed stitch in the Shanfeng Emperor 1851 to 61. Oh, I guess it's not a question.
I don't recall. I don't recall that. Bob asked an excellent question. I'm going to have to go do some homework, and I cleared up a couple of questions from the first presentation tonight. I may have to recant and revise my stance on when seed stitch was introduced. So I need to go do some homework. I would say to Chuck, who has developed into something of an email correspondent with me since the last presentation, congratulations on identifying the Pacific Asia Museum rank badges. After the next lecture, I would expect you to go back and now date them as well as identify them.
Okay, Ruth Anderson asked, did men or women embroider these badges in the workshops? Were there workshops in most cities and therefore possibly regional styles?
The answer to all those questions are yes. There were shops that made rank badges. They employed men and young boys. There were probably levels of shops too. I suspect that the first three ranks were only sold in one shop. The second, from fourth to seventh, were probably sold in a different kind of shop. And eighth and ninth, those people who had joined the bureaucracy after a term as a chief clerk, as opposed to passing an examination system, probably shopped in places that only catered to them. And so the rank badges were made by males. They were made throughout the country. And there is one particular style that I tend to classify as a regional style and I've never been able to identify the region, but it always has a canopy over the rank creature, and it generally has a yellowish brown ochre kind of a palette to it. And I'm convinced that that is a regional design and characteristic of a particular region, but I have never been able to identify the region.
Well, I think that's all the questions so far.
Well, if those are all the questions, I think that all of you probably will be looking forward to our next meeting, which I think will be on March 7th, and it will be the conclusion of the evolution of Chinese rank badge design. I'm looking forward to it mainly because these type of badges are the badges that were available to me. And so I have a few rank badges and they tend to all be the later period. And maybe some of you have rank badges. I know years ago when David gave his lecture on rank badges to us, and maybe 20 years ago, we had members who brought in rank badges and they were eye openers, I think. But so maybe next time you can look over your rank badges, any of you, and maybe bring some questions about the badges that you people own.
And Bob, if I may, if anybody has a rank badge that they would like me to comment on specifically, if they would send it to me in an email, I would be happy to try and incorporate it into the next presentation. So if somebody wants to say, is this real, or when was this done, or what rank creature is it, whatever, if they'd like to send that to me, I'd be happy to try and incorporate it into the next presentation.
Well, I hope people will take advantage of this invitation. Like I say, this will be our next program, and I think there was an error made in the announcement we had that this lecture was going to be the final lecture. It's actually going to be our middle lecture, and I hope all of you will attend next month. The other thing I wanted to make available to you, some of you had said that the previous, before the pandemic, China Society almost always had a dinner followed by a program. It was something that was very personal that people attended, and we've had people who sort of missed not having the company and not being to see one another. So as we close this session, I've asked Felicia to open up the program on Zoom so everybody can, you can, I guess, click the video and maybe you can see one another and hopefully say hello to one another.
Bob, before you do that, excuse me, but I think I had a message that was sent to me asking for my email. Let me make a general announcement so that my invitation actually means something. My email is dhugus@aol.com. dhugus@aol.com. Thank you.
Well, should we open it